Hello and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Tonight we are going somewhere far across an ocean, across more than 1,000 years, into a world of mountains and rice paddies and castle walls that touch the clouds, the samurai. Almost everyone has heard the word. Most people picture the sword, the armor, the rigid code of honor. But very few people know where any of it actually came from, and the answer, it turns out, is far more complicated, far more human, and honestly far more interesting than the legend ever let on. If you are enjoying what we do here, take just a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it means these stories can keep finding their way to people who need them. And before we begin, drop your location and your local time in the comments below. Whether it is midnight in Melbourne or 10:30 in Manchester, there is something quietly wonderful about knowing people all over the world are settling in at the same time, listening to the same story. You might even help a fellow insomniac find their way here. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let your shoulders drop. Tonight we are drifting back to the islands of Japan, back to a time before the samurai had a name, back to when the sword was just a tool and the warrior was just a man with a very particular set of problems to solve. Japan in the early 800s was not a unified country in any modern sense of the word. It was a collection of provinces, some productive, some wild, many of them barely reachable from the capital, all loosely bound together under an imperial system that had been carefully copied from Tang Dynasty China about a century and a half earlier. The idea behind the copy was sound enough. A centralized state, a professional bureaucracy, a census system, land redistribution, and an imperial army conscripted from the peasant population. Clean on paper, difficult in practice, and on the Japanese islands, it slowly came apart almost from the moment it was assembled. The problem was geography. Japan is not an easy place to administer. Its interior is dominated by mountains, steep forested, and deeply inconvenient for anyone trying to move troops or collect taxes at speed. The coast is long and irregular. The provinces at the eastern and northern edges of Honshu, the main island, sat far beyond the comfortable reach of the imperial court in the capital at Nara, and later at the new capital of Heian-kyo, the city that would eventually be known as Kyoto. Establishing that new capital happened in 794, partly for spiritual reasons, and partly because the court wanted distance from the Buddhist monasteries in Nara that had accumulated uncomfortable amounts of political influence. The court moved. The problems did not. Out in the provinces, the conscript army system had been quietly failing for decades. The men drafted under it were farmers, pulled away from the rice paddies during the most labor-intensive parts of the agricultural year, given minimal training, and sent to patrol frontier regions against the Amishi, the indigenous people of the northeast who resisted imperial expansion with considerable effectiveness. Conscript soldiers who had no personal stake in the outcome of a distant frontier campaign made unreliable soldiers. They deserted, they got sick, they arrived without adequate equipment. By 792, the imperial court had largely acknowledged what everyone in the provinces already knew and began moving away from universal conscription, shifting instead toward a different approach, one that would, over the next 2 centuries, produce something the court never entirely intended. The new approach relied on konde, which roughly translates to stalwart youth. These were the sons of wealthy provincial landowners, men who could afford their own horses, their own weapons, and their own equipment. They trained on their own land. They fought in their own interest as much as the emperors. They were, in the most practical sense, a military class rooted in property and regional identity rather than in imperial service. The court had, essentially, outsourced its security problem to the people best positioned to handle it, and in doing so, handed those people a great deal of quiet power. The word samurai comes from a Japanese verb, saburao, meaning to serve or to attend. In its earliest usage, it had nothing to do with warfare at all. A samurai was simply a person who waited upon someone of higher rank, an attendant, a retainer, a member of a household staff who happened to also be useful in a fight. The word bushi, meaning warrior or military man, is actually the older and more purely martial term. Over time, the two words blurred together and eventually became interchangeable, but in those early centuries the distinction mattered. A samurai was defined first by whom he served, and only second by what he could do with a weapon. Loyalty was built into the word before the sword was. What these early provincial warriors fought with, and how they fought, was also quite different from the image most people carry around. The iconic weapon of the samurai in popular imagination is the curved sword, the katana, elegant and precise and polished to a mirror finish. But in the early 900s, the weapon that defined the Japanese warrior was the bow. Mounted archery was the core of elite military practice. A warrior on horseback, drawing a long asymmetric bow at a full gallop, was the military technology that the provincial clans had perfected, and it was that combination of horsemanship and archery that separated a serious warrior family from an ordinary household. The sword existed and was certainly used, but it was a secondary weapon, something you reached for when the arrows ran out or the distance closed. The armor of this period was also practical rather than ceremonial. The early Japanese lamella armor, built from small lacquered scales of leather or iron laced together with silk or leather cords, was designed for a mounted archer flexible enough to allow a full draw of the bow, layered heavily across the shoulders and chest, and constructed to be put on and taken off relatively quickly. It was not yet the elaborate, almost architectural armor of the later Sengoku period. It was working equipment made by craftsmen who understood that the man wearing it needed to stay alive and mobile. The families who excelled in this martial world began accumulating land, followers, and regional reputations across generations. A warrior of proven ability would attract younger men willing to serve under him. His sons would inherit his reputation along with his land. His followers' sons would follow his sons. Over 2 or 3 generations, what had begun as a practical arrangement became something more structured, a network of obligation, loyalty, and mutual benefit that looked less like a military unit and more like a social institution. These networks would eventually become the great warrior clans of Japanese history. 2 names above all others would come to define that process. The Minamoto clan, also known by their Chinese reading as the Genji, spread through the eastern provinces of Honshu and built their reputation in the hard frontier country of the northeast. The Taira, known alternatively as the Heike, established themselves closer to the capital and developed deep ties with the court aristocracy. Both clans traced their origins to imperial princes who had been removed from the line of succession and given family names as a way of reducing the cost of maintaining an ever-expanding imperial family. It was, in a quietly ruthless bit of administrative logic, a way of turning surplus royalty into something useful. The princes became provincial lords. The provincial lords became warriors. The warriors became something the court would spend the next 4 centuries trying to control and failing to manage. None of this happened in a single dramatic moment. There was no founding declaration, no coronation of the first samurai, no single battle that marked the beginning of the warrior class. It grew the way most durable institutions grow, gradually, practically, in response to problems that no one had planned for, shaped by geography and economics as much as by any human intention. The court in Heian-kyo continued to govern, to hold elaborate ceremonies, to compose poetry, and to arrange marriages with careful attention to rank and protocol. Out in the provinces, the men the court increasingly depended upon for its actual security were building something new, something that had no name yet, but was already beginning to develop its own logic, its own values, and its own quiet confidence that the sword, in the end, mattered more than the poem. The warrior class had arrived. It would take several more centuries before the rest of Japan fully understood what that meant. The clans that shook the court. For most of the Heian period, the imperial court at Heiankyo operated on a principle that might generously be described as elegant fiction. The emperor sat at the center of everything in theory, divine by bloodline, supreme by tradition, surrounded by ritual and ceremony, and a calendar of obligations so detailed that it left very little room for anything as inconvenient as actual governing. In practice, real power had been quietly gathered by a single aristocratic family, the Fujiwara, who had perfected over generations the art of placing their daughters in the imperial household, ensuring that the next emperor was almost always a Fujiwara grandson, and then governing on his behalf as regent while he was young, and as chief advisor once he reached adulthood. It was a system of enormous sophistication and almost no military muscle whatsoever. The Fujiwara at their height in the late 900s and early 1000s controlled appointments, land grants, and court policy with remarkable efficiency. Fujiwara no Michinaga, who dominated the court around the year 1000, is remembered for composing a short poem comparing himself to the full moon, nothing lacking, nothing hidden. He was not being modest. 3 of his daughters became empress consorts. His grandsons sat on the throne. He never bothered to formally take the title of regent because he did not need it. Power that obvious does not require a label. But the Fujiwara system contained a structural weakness that became clearer as the 1100s approached. It depended entirely on producing daughters who could be placed in the imperial household and sons who could manage the bureaucracy. When the bloodlines thinned or the marriages failed to produce the right heirs at the right time, the whole mechanism stuttered. And it had a second vulnerability that was harder to engineer around. It could not defend itself. The Fujiwara had no army. The court had no standing military force of any real strength. When problems arose that required something more forceful than a strongly worded imperial decree, someone had to be called. That someone was increasingly drawn from the Minamoto and Taira clans. The 2 clans had been building their provincial networks for generations by this point, and by the mid-1100s they were well-established presences in the military landscape of Japan. The Minamoto had their base of strength in the Kanto Plain, the broad agricultural region of eastern Honshu that would centuries later become the heartland of Japanese military power. The Taira had cultivated closer ties to the capital region and the western provinces, and had developed a more courtly manner than their eastern counterparts, which turned out to be a strategic advantage in a world where access to the court determined everything. The system of retired emperors, known as insei, added another layer of complication. Beginning in the late 1100s, several emperors had abdicated while still relatively young, formally passing the throne to a successor while continuing to exercise political influence from retirement. A retired emperor was no longer bound by the ceremonial constraints of the reigning emperor's position, which meant he could act more directly in political affairs. What this produced, in practical terms, was a court with multiple competing centers of authority, the reigning emperor, the regent, the retired emperor, and the powerful aristocratic households all pulling in different directions and increasingly willing to hire warriors to settle the arguments. The moment that changed everything arrived in 1156. A succession dispute following the death of Emperor Toba split the court into 2 factions, one supporting the reigning Emperor Go-Shirakawa and one supporting the retired Emperor Sutoku, who believed he had been passed over unfairly. Both sides called upon warrior allies. Both sides sent armed men into the streets of the capital. The conflict is known as the Hogan Rebellion, and while it lasted only a matter of days, its consequences reordered the political world of Japan in ways that nobody who started it had intended. Taira no Kiyomori fought on the winning side, supporting Go-Shirakawa. So did Minamoto no Yoshitomo. The rebellion was suppressed quickly. The losing faction was dealt with harshly, and for a brief moment, the 2 great warrior clans stood together in the capital as victors, rewarded with rank and favour. It should perhaps have been a warning to the court that they had just demonstrated, in front of everyone, that political disputes in Japan could now be resolved by armed force rather than by ceremony. 3 years later, the lesson was reinforced. In 1159, a conflict known as the Heiji Rebellion broke out between the two clans themselves. The specific political triggers were complicated factionalism at court, resentment over appointments and rewards, a dispute about who should control the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, but the underlying reality was straightforward. The Minamoto, under Yoshitomo, moved against the Taira, while Kiyomori was away from the capital on a pilgrimage to a Shinto shrine. Yoshitomo seized the retired emperor and set fire to the Sanjo Palace in the process. It was, by any measure, a bold opening. Kiyomori returned faster than Yoshitomo had calculated, rallied his forces, and crushed the Minamoto in fighting around the capital with a decisiveness that settled the question of which clan would dominate for the next 20 years. Yoshitomo was killed while fleeing. Most of the senior Minamoto leaders were executed. Kiyomori, in what would later look like either mercy or a significant oversight, depending on your perspective, chose to spare several of Yoshitomo's young sons. They were children, he apparently reasoned, and not worth the trouble of killing. One of those children was a boy named Yoritomo. Another was a younger son named Yoshitsune. Kiyomori sent them into provincial exile rather than to their deaths, and in doing so quietly planted the seeds of everything that would follow. It is the kind of decision that looks reasonable at the time and catastrophic in retrospect, which describes a remarkable number of decisions made by powerful men throughout history. With the Minamoto broken and scattered, Taira no Kiyomori moved into a position of dominance at the Heian court that no warrior had ever held before. He accumulated titles and offices with a speed that must have made the old aristocratic families deeply uncomfortable. He became a senior counselor, then a minister, and in 1167 he was appointed Daijo Daijin Grand Chancellor, the highest civil office in the imperial government. He was the first warrior in Japanese history to hold that position, which had previously been reserved for men of the most refined aristocratic lineage. The court families noted this with the kind of quiet horror that people of very established background reserve for anyone they consider an outsider ascending to places they did not earn by birth. Kiyomori did not stop there. He arranged marriages between his daughters and imperial princes with the same calculated efficiency the Fujiwara had once used. His daughter Tokuko became the consort of Emperor Takakura and eventually the mother of Emperor Antoku, which meant that by the 1170s Kiyomori could look at the reigning emperor and identify him as his grandson. He had, in the space of roughly 15 years, replicated the entire Fujiwara playbook using military power as his initial lever rather than aristocratic bloodline. It was an impressive performance and a thoroughly destabilizing one, because unlike the Fujiwara, who had spent centuries weaving themselves into the fabric of court culture, Kiyomori represented something the court had never fully absorbed. He was still, at bottom, a warrior, and the courtiers around him never forgot it even when they were bowing to him. The Taira clan during these years filled the capital with their supporters and relatives. Appointments went to Taira allies. Estates were redistributed toward Taira loyalists. Families who had held provincial income rights for generations found those rights reassigned. The resentment this generated spread outward from the capital through the provinces, and it found willing audiences among the Minamoto survivors in exile in the east, among dispossessed provincial lords, and among the Buddhist monasteries, which had their own long history of political grievance and occasional armed monks. A coalition of opposition was forming, slowly and without central organization, in the years when Kiyomori seemed most secure. Kiyomori himself grew less cautious as his position solidified. He moved the capital briefly to a new site on the western coast, a decision that generated enormous disruption and was reversed within months. He humiliated retired emperors who opposed him. When a plot against him was discovered in 1179, he responded by removing over 40 court officials from their positions in a single day, an act so blunt that even people who had been willing to accommodate his rise began privately reconsidering their options. The Heian court, which had survived for nearly 4 centuries on the careful management of appearances and alliances, had allowed armed men through its gates to settle its internal quarrels. Now those men were running the building, the war that split the sky. Taira no Kiyomori died in the 2nd month of 1181, reportedly consumed by a fever so severe that those around him claimed his body radiated heat like burning charcoal. He had spent his final months watching the war he had always feared begin to take shape around him, and he did not live to see how it ended. By the time of his death, the Genpei War had already been running for nearly a year, and the machinery he had built, the marriages, the appointments, the careful accumulation of power through a single clan was already beginning to show its weaknesses under the pressure of a conflict that stretched across the entire country. The war had its formal beginning not with a battle but with a document. In the 4th month of 1180, a prince of the imperial family named Mochihito, who had been passed over for the throne and harboured considerable bitterness about it, issued a call to arms directed at the Minamoto clan and any other warrior family willing to move against the Taira. The call was technically treasonous. Mochihito was not in a position of authority that gave him the right to issue such an order, and the Taira discovered and moved against him almost immediately. He was killed within weeks, but the document had already been copied and sent out across the provinces, and its contents were more important than its author. It gave the Minamoto an imperial mandate, or something that could be presented as one, and in a political culture where legitimacy mattered as much as military strength, that was a valuable thing to have. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the exiled son of Yoshitomo, who had been spared after the Heiji rebellion, received the document in the eastern province of Izu, where he had spent the previous 20 years living under provincial supervision. He was in his early 30s by this point, steady in temperament where his father had been impulsive, careful where others rushed. He had spent 2 decades watching, building quiet connections with local warrior families, and apparently thinking at considerable length about what he would do if an opportunity presented itself. The opportunity had now arrived, and he moved with the kind of measured decisiveness that suggests he had been planning his response long before the letter reached him. His first attempt did not go especially well. Moving too quickly with insufficient forces, he was defeated at the Battle of Ishibashiyama in the 8th month of 1180 and forced to flee into the mountains with a handful of followers. But the defeat was temporary. The eastern provinces, the Kanto region where Minamoto influence ran deep through generations of family connections, rallied to him with a speed that suggests the Taira's administration of the region had not generated much affection. Within months, Yoritomo had assembled a substantial force, established his base at Kamakura, a defensible coastal location in the east, and begun the careful organizational work of turning a regional uprising into something with the structure and staying power to fight a prolonged war. The Taira, meanwhile, were discovering that controlling the capital and controlling the country were not the same thing. Their strength was concentrated in the west and in the court apparatus, and the further east you went, the thinner their authority became. They sent armies eastward but achieved no decisive results, partly because the geography of the Kanto region favoured defenders, and partly because Yoritomo was disciplined enough not to rush a battle he did not need to fight. He was consolidating, recruiting, and waiting for the Taira to come to him on ground of his choosing. In the 9th month of 1180, a Taira force moving east encountered the Minamoto at the Fujigawa River and withdrew after being startled by the sound of a large flock of water birds taking flight in the night, mistaking the noise for an enemy attack. It was not the most glorious moment in the Taira military record, and people were still mentioning it decades later. The conflict grew more complicated in 1182 and 1183 when a second Minamoto force emerged. This one from the northern provinces under the command of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a cousin of Yoritomo who was fierce, effective, and considerably more difficult to work with than his military reputation suggested. Yoshinaka pushed south and west through central Japan with considerable force, and drove the Taira out of the capital at Heian-kyo in the 7th month of 1183. The imperial court and the young Emperor Antoku were taken westward by the retreating Taira, along with the imperial regalia, the sword, the mirror, and the jewel that constituted the physical symbols of imperial legitimacy. Their removal was significant. An emperor without regalia occupied an ambiguous position, and the Taira understood this very well. Yoshinaka entered the capital in triumph, which was when his problems truly began. His troops, who were from the rough northern provinces and had spent months on campaign, treated the city and its inhabitants with the kind of casual disregard that military forces historically demonstrate towards civilian populations when no one is giving them firm orders to behave otherwise. The court aristocrats who had hoped to be liberated found themselves dealing with a different set of difficulties than the ones they had endured under the Taira. Yoshinaka's political skills were not equal to his battlefield skills. His relationship with Yoritomo deteriorated rapidly, and by early 1184 he had managed the considerable achievement of making almost everyone in the capital want him gone. Yoritomo sent forces west to deal with his cousin, led by his younger brothers Noriori and the youngest of the spared sons, Yoshitsune, who was by this point in his mid-20s and who was developing a reputation as a military commander of unusual speed and tactical creativity. Yoshinaka was defeated and killed in the first month of 1184. His removal consolidated Minamoto command of the campaign under Yoritomo's direction, which was probably the outcome Yoritomo had intended from the beginning. The war now moved to its final phase, and this phase was defined almost entirely by Yoshitsune. At the Battle of Ichi no Tani in the 2nd month of 1184, the Taira had established a fortified position along the coast west of the capital, with mountains behind them and the sea in front. The conventional approach would have been to assault the fortified coastal face. Yoshitsune instead led a force down the near vertical mountainside behind the Taira position, descending terrain that the defenders had considered impassable and attacking from a direction nobody had prepared for. The Taira position collapsed. It was the kind of tactical decision that looks either brilliant or reckless depending on whether it works, and in this case it worked. The surviving Taira retreated further west, pulling the young emperor and the imperial regalia with them, relying on their naval strength in the inland sea, the body of water between the main island of Honshu and the southern island of Shikoku, where they had considerable experience and the Minamoto had very little. In the first month of 1185, Yoshitsune struck again at Yashima on the northern coast of Shikoku, attacking with a small force across the water in stormy conditions that the Taira had considered prohibitive for a crossing. The attack succeeded in driving the Taira off Shikoku and further out to sea. The final confrontation came at Danno-ura, a strait at the western tip of Honshu where the inland sea opens into the wider ocean. On the 24th day of the 3rd month of 1185, the Taira and Minamoto fleets met in a battle that was decided partly by fighting and partly by defection. Several Taira allied commanders switched sides during the engagement, and knowledge of which ships were carrying the emperor and the regalia passed to the Minamoto as a result. The battle was decisive and swift. The Taira, understanding that the war was finished, began killing themselves rather than surrendering. Taira no Tomomori, one of the senior commanders, is said to have put on a second suit of armor to make himself heavy enough to sink and walked off the side of his ship. The young Emperor Antoku, 7 years old, was carried into the water by his grandmother Nii-dono, who told him that beneath the waves was another world, as clean and peaceful as a capital. He drowned. 2 of the 3 imperial regalia were lost to the sea with him, though the mirror was later recovered. The jewel and the original sword were gone, and the court quietly produced replacements and did not discuss the matter at length. The Genpei War ended at Dan-no-ura, with the Taira clan effectively destroyed as a political force. What it established, beyond the obvious military victory, was a new principle that would govern Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries. Armed power, properly organized, could override every other form of authority that the old court system recognized. Yoritomo had not just defeated the Taira, he had demonstrated that a warrior with enough loyal followers and enough organizational discipline could reshape the political order of Japan from the outside in. The question of what to build in place of what he had dismantled was the next problem, and it was one that Yoritomo had already been thinking about very carefully indeed. The shogun's quiet revolution. Yoritomo never moved to the capital. This was not an oversight. While the Genpei War was still being fought, while his brothers were leading campaigns across western Japan and the Taira were retreating toward the sea, Yoritomo stayed in Kamakura, managing correspondence, receiving oaths of loyalty from provincial warriors, and constructing the administrative machinery of a government that did not yet officially exist. When the war ended at Dan-no-Yura, he did not ride into Heian-kyo in triumph. He sent representatives. He accepted honors through intermediaries. He kept his base in the east, surrounded by the warrior families whose loyalty he had spent years carefully cultivating, and he governed from there. The decision was deliberate, and it shaped the next 7 centuries of Japanese history more than any single battle had. What Yoritomo understood, with a clarity that distinguished him from almost every other military figure of his era, was that the capital was a trap. The Taira had entered the court, absorbed its culture, arranged marriages into the imperial family, and in doing so had made themselves vulnerable to the court's internal politics, its factions, its endless ceremonial obligations, and its tendency to absorb powerful outsiders and eventually digest them. He had watched this happen. He had no intention of repeating it. His government would exist alongside the imperial court, would nominally serve it and preserve its forms, but would do so from a safe geographic and psychological distance. The administrative system he built at Kamakura drew on practices that had been developing among warrior clans for generations, but formalized and extended them into something genuinely new. His core constituency was the Gokenin housemen, direct vassals who had pledged personal loyalty to Yoritomo in exchange for his protection and recognition of their land rights. The Gokenin system was not feudalism in the European sense, though later historians would reach for that comparison. It was a network of bilateral obligations, each relationship negotiated and maintained individually, with Yoritomo at the center as the acknowledged source of authority and legitimacy for warrior landholders across the provinces. To extend that authority across the country, Yoritomo established 2 new categories of official that the imperial system had never had. Shugo, or military governors, were appointed to each province with responsibility for maintaining order, commanding military forces when needed, and overseeing the Gokenin in their territory. Jito, or land stewards, were placed on individual estates, including estates that still nominally belonged to court families and Buddhist institutions, with authority over local administration and tax collection. The Jito system was particularly significant because it inserted Yoritomo's men into the economic life of the country at the most granular level possible, giving the Kamakura government a presence and a financial stake in lands that had previously been entirely outside warrior administration. The court in Heian-kyo was not dismantled. The emperor continued to reign. Aristocrats continued to hold their titles and receive their stipends, and compose their poetry and arrange their carriages in the correct ceremonial order. What changed was that the things the court had always controlled, appointments, land rights, the adjudication of property disputes, now required Kamakura's approval to mean anything in practice. The imperial government retained its forms while gradually losing its functions, which is a transition that tends to happen slowly enough that no one can point to the exact moment it became irreversible. Yoritomo received the title of Sei Taishogun Great Barbarian Subduing General, a title with ancient origins but new meaning from the imperial court in 1192. The title of shogun would become the formal designation for Japan's military rulers for nearly 7 centuries, and the government of the shogun, called the bakufu or tent government, would remain the real center of Japanese political power through most of that period. The imperial family would continue to exist, continue to be honored, and continue to serve as the ultimate source of theoretical legitimacy, but actual governance was now a military matter conducted by military men. The arrangement suited almost everyone involved, at least initially, because it allowed the court to preserve its dignity without the exhausting responsibility of actual administration, and it gave the warrior class the authority they had effectively already possessed, without the social awkwardness of having to pretend otherwise. There was one significant piece of unfinished business that Yoritomo addressed during these years, and it stands as the most revealing episode in his character. His younger brother Yoshitsune, the tactician who had delivered the military victories at Ichinotani, Yashima, and Dan-no-ura, had accepted honors and appointments directly from the imperial court without Yoritomo's permission. The offense sounds procedural, because it was procedural. Yoritomo's political system depended on the principle that all grants of authority flowed through him, and Yoshitsune had accepted a bypass of that principle, perhaps without fully understanding what he was doing. Yoritomo's response was to declare his brother an enemy and spend the next several years hunting him across Japan. Yoshitsune fled north, sheltered by a northern lord named Fujiwara no Hidehira, and survived until Hidehira's death in 1187. Hidehira's successor, under pressure from Kamakura, turned on his guest. Yoshitsune died in the 4th month of 1189, taking his own life in a small hall in the northern provinces while his retainers held off the forces closing around him. He was 31 years old. The gap between his military genius and his political instincts was the thing that killed him, which is a pattern that repeats often enough in history to qualify as a theme rather than a coincidence. Yoritomo died in 1199 under circumstances that have never been entirely explained. The most commonly cited account says he fell from his horse while attending the dedication of a bridge, was injured, and never recovered. He was 52 years old. There was a brief period of instability following his death as his sons attempted to maintain the Kamakura government, but neither son proved durable. His first son Yorie was effectively sidelined by the council of senior vassals within a few years and died in confinement. His second son Sanetomo held the title of shogun for nearly 2 decades, but had limited real power and was assassinated in 1219 at a shrine in Kamakura by his own nephew, which gives some indication of how smoothly the transition of power was proceeding. Into this vacuum stepped the family of Yoritomo's widow, Hojo Masako. The Hojo were a provincial warrior family from Izu, the same region where Yoritomo had spent his years of exile, and Masako herself was a figure of considerable political ability. After her husband's death, she took Buddhist vows, as widows of high status conventionally did, but the vows did not slow her political activity in any detectable way. She and her father, and then her brother Hojo Yoshitoki, moved systematically to consolidate control of the Kamakura government. The mechanism they used was the position of shikken, or regent to the shogun, who was himself a regent to the emperor. Japan had thus achieved the remarkable administrative architecture of a regent governing a symbolic sovereign, which somehow functioned for decades without anyone deciding it was too complicated. The Hojo family would hold the position of shikken and the real power of the Kamakura government for over a century. What Yoritomo had built survived his death because the institutional structures he created were solid enough to continue functioning without him at the center. The Gokunin system, the Shugo and Jito appointments, the practice of Kamakura issuing binding legal decisions on land disputes, all of these continued under Hojo direction, and over time became more elaborate and more deeply embedded in the daily administrative life of the country. The Kamakura period produced one of the earliest systematic legal codes in Japanese history, the Goseibai Shikimoku of 1232, which laid out rules for resolving disputes among warriors with a straightforwardness and practicality that contrasted sharply with the elaborate precedent-based deliberations of the old court system. The samurai as a class had, by the mid-1300s, acquired something they had not possessed during the Heian period: an institutional home, a legal framework, and a government that recognized their values as the values worth governing by. The rough provincial warriors who had ridden into the capital during the Hogan Rebellion to settle an argument between court factions were now the people who decided what the law said and who enforced it. The transformation had taken about a century from start to finish, which is fast by historical standards for the complete reordering of a society's power structure, and yet it had happened gradually enough that no single moment felt like a revolution. The old court had not been destroyed. It had been preserved carefully, like a beautiful and expensive object that everyone agrees should be kept in a display case where nothing can damage it. Storms from the sea. In the years after the Kamakura shogunate consolidated its authority over Japan, the country existed in a kind of structured isolation. Trade happened. Monks and merchants crossed the waters to and from the Korean peninsula and China. Ideas and goods moved back and forth with reasonable regularity, but Japan had no powerful neighbours with obvious territorial ambitions toward it, and the surrounding sea provided a natural buffer that the island's inhabitants had never had much reason to think about as either an advantage or a vulnerability. That changed in the 1260s, when letters began arriving from the continent bearing the seal of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was at this point in the process of assembling the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. He had inherited the Mongol conquests of his grandfather Genghis Khan and extended them, bringing the southern Song dynasty of China under Mongol control, a campaign that took decades and enormous resources, and establishing the Yuan dynasty as the governing authority over China. He had vassalized Korea. He was directing military operations in Southeast Asia. The letter he sent to Japan in 1268 was courteous in tone and unambiguous in meaning. Japan should acknowledge Mongol suzerainty, establish diplomatic relations, and pay tribute. The alternative was left to the recipient's imagination, though the imagination did not have to work very hard given the track record of places that had declined similar invitations from the Mongols. The Kamakura shogunate was governed at this point by the regent Hojo Tokimune, who was 18 years old when the first letter arrived and who responded by not responding. Japan sent no reply. More letters came. They were also not answered. Envoys arrived on Japanese shores and were turned away. Tokimune's refusal to engage has been presented in Japanese historical tradition as an act of exceptional courage, which it may well have been, though it is also possible that the shogunate was uncertain how to respond and found continued silence easier than any available alternative. Eventually Kublai Khan ran out of patience. The first invasion fleet assembled in Korea and launched in the 10th month of 1274. The force was substantial. Estimates suggest something between 20,000 and 40,000 men, drawn from Mongol, Chinese, and Korean contingents, transported on Korean-built ships. They moved along the island chain off the northwestern coast of Kyushu, taking Tsushima and Iki Islands before landing at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu proper. What followed was one of the more disorienting military encounters in Japanese history, not because of who won or lost, but because of how profoundly the two sides' approaches to warfare failed to connect with each other. Japanese warrior combat, as it had developed over the previous centuries, was built around individual performance. Battles began with formal declarations. Warriors identified themselves and their lineage before engaging, and single combat between named opponents carried significant honor and practical importance within the warrior value system. The Mongol forces at Hakata Bay did not operate this way at all. They fought in coordinated mass formations, used signal drums and flags to direct large units simultaneously, and deployed weapons that Japanese warriors had simply never encountered. Explosive projectiles that burst with noise and flame, clouds of arrows from massed crossbowmen, and a tactical fluidity that made individual heroics not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. A samurai riding forward to challenge a named opponent found himself facing an organized volley from 50 archers rather than a single opponent riding out to meet him. The Japanese defenders were pushed back from the beachhead and suffered significant casualties. The fighting was difficult. The Mongol techniques were deeply unsettling to warriors trained in a completely different military tradition, and the tactical situation by nightfall of the first day was not favorable for the defenders. Then, during the night, the Mongol fleet withdrew from the bay. The exact reason has been debated ever since. A storm may have damaged the ships. The Mongol commanders may have decided their supply situation was inadequate for a continued inland campaign. The Korean sailors who crewed much of the fleet may have pressed for withdrawal given the weather conditions. Whatever the combination of factors, the fleet pulled back and eventually returned to Korea, leaving the Japanese to assess what had happened and prepare for what was presumably coming next. What Hakata Bay had revealed was a serious tactical problem. The Japanese warrior tradition, refined through the Genpei War and the internal conflicts of the Kamakura period, was admirably suited for fighting other Japanese warriors operating by the same general assumptions. It was not well matched against mass formation warfare supported by ranged weapons the defenders had never trained against. The shogunate understood this clearly enough, and spent the years between the two invasions building a stone defensive wall along the coast of Hakata Bay, a straightforward and practical piece of military engineering that has no particular romantic quality but demonstrated a sensible grasp of what the next invasion would likely look like. The second invasion came in 1281, and it was considerably larger than the first. Kublai Khan assembled two separate forces, an eastern route army of roughly 40,000 men launching from Korea, and a Jiangnan army of perhaps 100,000 drawn from the former southern Song territories launching from ports on the Chinese coast. The combined force, if the numbers are even approximately accurate, represented one of the largest amphibious operations in medieval history. The defensive wall along Hakata Bay slowed the Eastern Route Army's landing attempts significantly. The stone barrier that the defenders had dismissed as unglamorous engineering turned out to be very useful when you needed to stop mounted soldiers from forming up on a beach, which is exactly the kind of problem that tends to produce more respect for unglamorous engineering. The fighting continued for weeks along the Kyushu coast, with the Japanese defenders holding the wall and conducting raids against the ships, and the Mongol forces struggling to establish a secure beachhead. The Jiangnan army had been delayed and the two invasion forces had not yet properly combined when the season turned. In the 7th month of 1281, a major typhoon struck Kyushu. The timing, arriving precisely when the Mongol fleet was at its most vulnerable, was attributed by the Japanese to divine intervention. They called the storm Kamikaze Divine Wind, the gods of Japan, protecting the islands from foreign conquest. The storm destroyed a substantial portion of the Mongol fleet, killing large numbers of soldiers who had been kept aboard the ships rather than landed. The invasion collapsed. The survivors withdrew, and Kublai Khan's plans for a third attempt were eventually abandoned, partly due to the costs of the two failed campaigns, and partly due to other pressing military commitments elsewhere in the empire. The kamikaze story settled deep into Japanese cultural and religious identity and would remain there with consequences that stretched far into the future. But the immediate aftermath of the invasions created a different kind of problem, one that was slower and quieter and ultimately more damaging to the Kamakura shogunate than the Mongols had ever managed to be in battle. The Gokunin who had fought in the defense of Kyushu expected rewards. This was how the warrior system worked. Loyalty was repaid with grants of land or income rights, and those grants were the economic foundation of the vassal relationship. But the Mongol invasions had produced no conquered territory to distribute. There were no Mongol estates to reassign to loyal warriors, no captured lands to grant as rewards for service. The shogunate had won, but it had won a defensive war, and defensive wars do not generate the spoils that pay the bills. Tokimune and his successors distributed what they could, but it was not enough, and the resentment this produced among warriors who had fought hard and been inadequately compensated, spread steadily through the decades that followed. The Kamakura shogunate had perhaps another half-century of functional authority ahead of it, but the structural weakness exposed by the post-invasion reward problem never fully healed. Provincial warriors who felt their service had gone unrewarded had less reason to remain loyal to Kamakura and more reason to listen to anyone offering a more attractive arrangement. The shogunate spent those final decades dealing with internal disputes, managing a warrior class that was growing restless, and trying to maintain an administrative system built for a simpler political landscape than the one Japan had become. When the challenge came, it came from an unexpected direction, not from outside the islands but from within, and from someone the Kamakura government had badly underestimated: the age of the warring province. The man who brought down the Kamakura shogunate was not a warrior lord with a large army and a long-standing grudge. He was an emperor. Emperor Go-Daigo came to the throne in 1318 with an unusual degree of personal ambition for a position that had, for generations, been defined by ceremonial passivity, and with a genuine conviction that the arrangement of the previous century-and-a-half warrior clans governing while emperors reigned was an aberration that a sufficiently determined emperor ought to be able to correct. He was not wrong that the arrangement was historically unusual. He was considerably wrong about his ability to reverse it by force. Go-Daigo attempted a coup against the shogunate twice. The first attempt, in 1324, was discovered before it properly began. The second, in 1331, forced him to flee the capital and establish a rival court in the mountains of Yoshino. The Kamakura shogunate sent an army to suppress him, which succeeded militarily but created a political problem by requiring loyal commanders to conduct extended campaigns in the south and west, while the shogunate's internal difficulties worsened. One of those commanders was a Minamoto descendant named Ashikaga Takauji, who had been sent west to put down Go-Daigo's supporters, and instead switched sides in 1333, attacked the Kamakura government's headquarters in Kyoto, and opened the door to Go-Daigo's return. The Kamakura shogunate collapsed with a speed that surprised nearly everyone. Another general attacked Kamakura itself in the same year. The last Hojo regent died in the fighting, and an institution that had governed Japan for nearly a century and a half was finished inside a few months. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto in triumph and launched what became known as the Kenmu Restoration, a genuine attempt to reimpose direct imperial governance, complete with land reassignments, new appointments, and the reorganization of administrative structures along pre-warrior lines. The warrior class, which had just helped him win, looked at these reforms with mounting dissatisfaction. The redistribution of land rights moved slowly and inconsistently. Decisions favored court aristocrats over warriors who expected concrete rewards for their service, and the basic question of how an imperial government without a military force was going to enforce anything in a country full of armed men was left unresolved. Ashikaga Takauji resolved it himself in 1335 by raising his own forces against Go-Daigo. The Kenmu Restoration lasted less than 3 years. Takauji drove Go-Daigo out of Kyoto again and established a new shogunate under his own family in 1336. This one centered in the Muromachi district of the capital rather than in distant Kamakura. Go-Daigo, refusing to accept defeat, set up a rival southern court in Yoshino and declared his imperial line the legitimate one. The Ashikaga backed a competing northern court in Kyoto. Japan now had 2 emperors simultaneously, which created a theological and political difficulty that the country managed to sustain, with varying degrees of discomfort, for over 50 years before the southern court was finally persuaded to accept reunification in 1392. The Ashikaga shogunate that emerged from this extended confusion was structurally weaker than its Kamakura predecessor from the beginning. The Hojo family had maintained central control in Kamakura by concentrating authority tightly. The Ashikaga needed the support of powerful regional lords to hold their position, and that support came at the price of conceding those lords considerable autonomy over their domains. The shugo, the provincial military governors, had during the conflicts of the 1400s gradually converted what had been administrative appointments into hereditary territorial power. They had become, in practice, regional rulers accountable to the shogunate in name while governing their territories largely as they chose. The Ashikaga shoguns at their peak, particularly the third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who managed the difficult task of reunifying the courts and brought the shogunate to its maximum authority in the 1390s, could project real power. Later, shoguns found that the machinery of authority had been slowly transferred to the men around them. The collapse, when it came, was triggered by a succession dispute. In the 1450s and early 1460s, a conflict over who would succeed, the ailing shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa drew in the two most powerful warrior families in the country, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, on opposite sides. The resulting conflict, known as the Onin War, began in 1467 and consisted primarily of extended fighting in and around the city of Kyoto for approximately 10 years, at the end of which nothing had been resolved. Roughly half the capital had burned. Both of the original primary commanders had died of natural causes during the fighting, and the shogunate's authority over the provinces was effectively finished. The Onin War is, by most measures, one of history's least satisfying conflicts, expensive, destructive, prolonged, and conclusive about nothing except that the people conducting it had very poor strategic judgment. What followed the Onin War was the period known as Sengoku, the Warring States, a century of near-constant warfare and political fragmentation that lasted from approximately the 1480s through the 1580s. The term borrows from a classical Chinese historical category and was applied to Japan's situation with reasonable accuracy. Central authority collapsed. The old Shugo families, weakened by the Onin War, found their positions challenged from below by subordinates, deputies, and provincial strongmen who had spent the war years building their own power while their masters were preoccupied in Kyoto. The Japanese concept of Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high, became one of the defining social realities of the period. A constable's deputy could become a regional lord. A regional lords general could become a regional lord himself. A man born in a peasant household could, with sufficient military talent and strategic intelligence, end up governing a province. This social fluidity was unprecedented in Japanese history and produced a warrior class with a different character than the one that had emerged during the Heian and Kamakura periods. The samurai of the Sengoku period fought in larger units, using different tactical formations and a broader range of weapons. Infantry forces of foot soldiers called ashigaru became increasingly central to battlefield outcomes, and the image of war as a contest between mounted aristocrats gave way to something closer to industrial-scale violence. Armies grew larger. Fortifications became more sophisticated. The construction of mountain castles commanding hilltop fortresses that served as both military strongpoints and administrative centers transformed the physical landscape of the Japanese countryside. The daimyo, who emerged from this competitive environment, were men shaped by the specific pressures of the Sengoku period. They needed military talent to survive, organizational ability to administer their domains efficiently enough to fund continued warfare, and political skill to manage alliances with neighbors who were simultaneously potential allies and potential enemies. They also needed, in many cases, a certain flexibility about the social conventions that had governed the warrior class in quieter times. A daimyo, who insisted on rewarding only warriors of appropriate lineage in a period when battles were won by the most effective fighters regardless of birth, was a daimyo who would not remain a daimyo for long. The institutional structures of the period reflected this pragmatism. Daimyo issued their own law codes, House laws governing everything from military service requirements to trade regulations to rules about marriage within the domain, creating miniature legal systems that operated entirely independently of the shogunate, which had ceased to function as a meaningful source of authority for most of the country. The Ashikaga shoguns continued to hold their title in Kyoto, presiding over a government whose actual reach had shrunk to the immediate vicinity of the capital, and whose commands were taken seriously by roughly nobody outside of polite earshot. They were expensive to maintain and difficult to remove because removing a shogun required someone to take responsibility for what came next, and nobody in the fragmented political landscape of the Sengoku period was yet in a position to answer that question. That position was being built, province by province, through the mid-1500s, in a small domain in central Japan called Owari, by a lord whose father had been a minor constable, and whose personal behaviour gave very little indication that he was the man who was going to end 100 years of war. The man who burned the old world. Oda Nobunaga was born in 1534 in the province of Owari, a mid-sized domain in central Honshu that had no particular distinction and no obvious reason to produce one of the most consequential figures in Japanese history. His father, Oda Nobuhide, was a capable minor lord who had expanded the family's position through a combination of warfare and shrewd alliance-making. But Owari was still a second-tier domain, and the Oda was still a second-tier family. Nobunaga's childhood reputation was not promising. He wandered the streets eating food with his hands, wore his clothing half-fastened, carried gourds of tea and food on his belt like someone who couldn't be bothered to go home for meals, and associated freely with commoners in ways that scandalized the retainers responsible for his upbringing. They called him Owari no Outsuke, the Fool of Owari, and they meant it as a description rather than an affectionate nickname. When his father died in 1551, and Nobunaga attended the funeral in his usual disheveled state, arriving late and leaving early, the senior retainers began seriously reconsidering their employment options. One of his own tutors wrote a letter of protest and then killed himself to underline the point, which in retrospect seems like a fairly extreme response to a teenager's table manners. What the retainers had failed to observe, beneath the deliberate casualness, was a young man who was paying close attention to everything around him and had already formed some unconventional conclusions about how the world worked. Nobunaga's apparent indifference to social convention was not incompetence. It was, at least in part, a calculated rejection of the behavioral codes that he could see were not producing results. The Sengoku period had been dismantling those codes for a century, and a lord who spent his energy maintaining appearances rather than building effective military and economic structures was a lord who would not survive the decade. Nobunaga grasped this earlier and more completely than most of his contemporaries. His first test came at the Battle of Okehazama in 1560, and it established the pattern that would define his career. The powerful eastern lord Imagawa Yoshimoto was moving through Owari with a force estimated at somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 men, heading toward Kyoto to intervene in the ongoing political confusion surrounding the shogunate. Nobunaga's total available forces were a fraction of that number. The rational response to being positioned between a very large army and its destination was to negotiate, concede, or simply get out of the way. Nobunaga attacked. He moved a small, fast force to the gorge at Okehazama, where Imagawa's army had paused to rest during a heavy rainstorm, struck the command position directly, and killed Imagawa Yoshimoto in the initial assault. An army of tens of thousands collapsed and dispersed when its commander was gone, which demonstrated something that Nobunaga filed carefully for future use, that concentrated force applied precisely at the correct point could defeat a much larger dispersed force, and that speed and surprise were worth more than numerical parity. Okehazama did not make him the dominant power in Japan overnight. It made him a serious regional player and removed one major threat, and it bought him the time to build further. He consolidated control of Owari, then moved into adjacent provinces, building alliances as he went. One of the most consequential alliances came early with a young lord from the neighboring Mikawa domain named Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would remain Nobunaga's ally for the rest of Nobunaga's life, and who was storing up observations about his partner's methods, with the patience of a man who expected to still be active when the immediate drama was over. Portuguese traders had brought firearms to the southern island of Kyushu in 1543, and Japanese craftsmen had been copying and producing them since almost immediately after. By the 1560s, firearms were not new in Japan, but their tactical use was inconsistent. The standard practice was to distribute arquebusiers among infantry units and use them as one element in a broader battle formation, where weather, loading time, and the general chaos of close-quarters fighting limited their effectiveness. Nobunaga reorganized their use systematically. By the time of the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, fought against the Takeda clan, whose cavalry was considered the finest in Japan, he had developed the practice of rotating volleys, with arquebusiers firing in sequence so that there was always a loaded weapon ready while others reloaded. The Takeda cavalry charged into layered volley fire from behind defensive palisades and was effectively destroyed as a military force. The battle is often cited as a decisive moment in Japanese military history, and while later scholarship has questioned some of the details of the traditional account, the underlying point stands: Nobunaga was applying systematic thought to weapons technology rather than using new tools in old ways. In 1568, he entered Kyoto with military force, ostensibly to install Ashikaga Yoshiaki as the new shogun, which gave his intervention a formal legitimacy it would otherwise have lacked. He used Yoshiaki as a useful political instrument for several years, issuing directives under the shogunal seal while making the actual decisions himself, until the relationship became more trouble than it was worth, and he expelled Yoshiaki from the capital in 1573. The Ashikaga shogunate, which had been declining for a century, ended not with a battle or a formal declaration, but with a shogun simply being asked to leave and having no means to refuse. The Ashikaga name continued to exist. The institution was finished. What Nobunaga was building in place of the old order was something Japan had not seen before: a unified administrative and military structure that overrode regional autonomy by force rather than negotiating around it. He was systematically reducing the independent power of every institution that stood outside his control. The Buddhist monasteries were a particular target. The great temples and their networks had maintained private armies for centuries, intervened in politics, held vast landholdings, and generally operated as sovereign entities within the country. Nobunaga had no interest in accommodating this. In 1571, he surrounded and burned the Enryakuji monastery complex on Mount Hiei above Kyoto, killing a substantial portion of the resident population. The destruction was thorough, and the message was unambiguous. Religious institutions would not receive exemptions from the new political order. This decision horrified a great many people, and was remembered in terms ranging from necessary ruthlessness to outright atrocity depending on the source. Nobunaga recorded his own view with characteristic economy and moved to the next problem. He fought a 10-year siege against the Iko-Iki, a Buddhist true Pure Land sect that had established what amounted to an autonomous religious state centered on the Ishiyama Honganji Temple in what is now Osaka. The Iko-Iki controlled significant territory, fielded effective military forces, and proved extremely difficult to dislodge from their fortified position. The siege finally ended in 1580 through negotiation rather than assault, with the temple community agreeing to withdraw. Nobunaga's economic policies also broke with precedent. His implementation of Rakuichi Rakuza free market zones that abolished the guild monopolies and toll checkpoints that had regulated commerce for generations opened trade and movement in ways that stimulated economic activity, while simultaneously undermining the financial structures of the institutions he was dismantling. The combination of military force and economic reorganization was dismantling the Sengoku landscape piece by piece. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled roughly half of Japan. He was sending armies into the western provinces under his general Toyotomi Hideyoshi and into the eastern regions under other commanders, systematically reducing the remaining independent lords. The process was not finished, but the direction was clear. Then, on the 21st day of the 6th month of 1582, one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned his forces against Nobunaga while he was staying with a small retinue at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto. The reasons behind Mitsuhide's decision have been debated ever since, without settled conclusion. Resentment over public humiliation, political calculation, personal ambition, and a constellation of grievances that had accumulated over years have all been proposed, and all have partial supporting evidence. Surrounded and with no possibility of rescue, Nobunaga set fire to the building and died inside. He was 48 years old. Mitsuhide's control of the situation lasted 11 days before one of Nobunaga's other generals came back from the Western campaign at extraordinary speed and killed him. That general was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and the rapidity of his response suggested that he had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. The sandal bearer and the old fox. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's origins were, by the standards of the warrior class, essentially non-existent. He was born around 1537 in Owari, the same province as Nobunaga, into a family of either peasants or very low-ranking foot soldiers, depending on the source, and the sources are inconsistent because Hideyoshi spent considerable effort in later life obscuring the details of his background. Once obscuring them became politically useful. What is reasonably clear is that he had no samurai lineage, no inherited land, and no family name worth mentioning when he first entered Nobunaga's service as a young man in some kind of menial capacity. One account describes his initial role as carrying Nobunaga's sandals. This detail has been repeated so often, it has the feel of a story that became too convenient to abandon whether or not it is precisely accurate. What elevated him was ability, demonstrated consistently over 2 decades of service. He showed administrative talent alongside military talent, which made him unusually valuable to Nobunaga, who needed men who could manage a captured province as efficiently as they could take one. Nobunaga called him Saru Monkey, a nickname that referred to Hideyoshi's physical appearance, which contemporary accounts describe as small, slight, and notably irregular in feature. Nobunaga was not known for sensitivity about this kind of thing, and Hideyoshi had the useful quality of being more interested in what the nickname meant for his position than in being offended by it. A warlord who calls you by a personal nickname is a warlord who is paying attention to you, and in Nobunaga's court, that attention was worth enduring quite a lot. When news of Nobunaga's death at Honnoji reached Hideyoshi in the 6th month of 1582, he was conducting a siege in the western provinces against the Mori clan. He negotiated a rapid ceasefire with the Mori, apparently without informing them immediately of what had happened in Kyoto, which simplified the negotiation considerably, and then moved his army back east, at a pace that military historians still cite as remarkable for the period. He covered roughly 200 li in under 2 weeks, arrived in the Kyoto region while Akechi Mitsuhide was still consolidating his position, and engaged him at the Battle of Yamazaki on the 2nd day of the 7th month. Mitsuhide was defeated in a battle that lasted approximately half a day. He died shortly after, reportedly killed by bandits while fleeing. The entire episode, from Nobunaga's death to Mitsuhide's end, took 13 days. Hideyoshi then moved with equal speed to claim Nobunaga's political legacy. The question of who would lead the Oda clan, and by extension who would continue the unification project, was nominally a matter for Nobunaga's surviving generals and family members to resolve. Hideyoshi convened a council at Kyozu in the 7th month of 1582, where he successfully backed Nobunaga's young grandson as nominal heir while positioning himself as the primary administrator. The more senior Oda generals who might have challenged this arrangement found themselves sidelined with a combination of political pressure, tactical alliance building, and the simple fact that Hideyoshi had moved faster than anyone else. His main military challenge came from Shibata Katsui, one of Nobunaga's most experienced generals, who allied with another Oda family member and contested Hideyoshi's primacy. The conflict was settled at the Battle of Shizugatake in 1583, where Hideyoshi won decisively. Katsui retreated to his castle at Kitanosho and set fire to it with his household inside, rather than surrender a choice that had a certain grim finality to it. With Katsui gone, Hideyoshi's position within the former Oda coalition was effectively uncontested among senior rivals, with one significant exception. Tokugawa Ieyasu had been Nobunaga's ally, not his subordinate, and he did not regard the transition of power after Honnoji as automatically elevating Hideyoshi above his own position. In 1584, the two men fought, or more precisely, their armies spent several months in inconclusive maneuvering around Komaki and Nagakute, where Ieyasu demonstrated that he could not be easily defeated, and Hideyoshi demonstrated that defeating Ieyasu was likely to be expensive relative to the benefit. The conflict ended in a negotiated peace that preserved Ieyasu's autonomy in his eastern domains while acknowledging Hideyoshi's overall primacy. Ieyasu later formalized his acceptance of Hideyoshi's authority by traveling to Osaka in 1586, and the two men reached a working arrangement that both apparently understood was indefinite rather than permanent. Hideyoshi continued the unification campaign through the late 1580s. By 1590, with the surrender of the Hojo clan in the east and subsequent campaigns in the north, Japan was effectively unified under his authority for the first time in over a century. He issued two edicts that permanently restructured Japanese society. The Katanagari, or sword hunt, of 1588 ordered the disarmament of non-warrior classes. Peasants, monks, and townspeople were required to surrender their weapons, which were collected and melted down for use in constructing a great Buddha statue, a detail of propaganda so efficient it converted a social control measure into an act of religious merit simultaneously. The Separation Edict of 1591 formalized the division between warriors, farmers, and townspeople, restricting movement between classes and requiring people to remain in the social category their current occupation defined. The fluid social mobility of the Sengoku period, where a peasant could become a general, was officially over. Hideyoshi himself had risen through that fluid world and was now closing the door behind him. He also launched two invasions of Korea, in 1592 and 1597, with the stated ambition of eventually conquering China. The campaigns were costly, strategically inconclusive, and deeply damaging to Japan's relationships with both Korea and China. Japanese forces achieved significant initial advances, penetrating deep into the Korean peninsula, before Korean naval resistance under Admiral Yi Sun-sin and the entry of Chinese Ming forces stabilized the situation and pushed back against the invasion. The wars dragged on, consuming resources and manpower, and ended definitively only with Hideyoshi's death in 1598. His motivations for the Korea campaigns have been analyzed extensively. Strategic miscalculation, the need to give the now unified warrior class somewhere to direct its energy, personal ambition on a scale that had lost touch with practical feasibility, and no single explanation fully accounts for a decision that cost so much and gained nothing lasting. Hideyoshi died in the 8th month of 1598, anxious above everything else about the survival of his young son Hideyori, who was 5 years old and the sole male heir to everything his father had built. He extracted oaths of loyalty to Hideyori from the council of 5 regents he established to govern during the boy's minority, and Ieyasu was prominent among them. He is reported to have wept while making these requests, which gives some measure of how clearly he understood, in those final months, the difference between what he had built and what was likely to remain of it once he was gone. Ieyasu began moving almost immediately. His maneuvering among the regent council, his cultivation of alliances with lords who felt marginalized by the dominant faction around Hideyori, and his careful accumulation of political support over the next 2 years brought the conflict to a head in 15 minutes on the 15th day of the 9th month of 1600 at a valley in central Japan called Sekigahara. The battle that followed lasted a full day and was decided partly by the defection of several lords on the opposing side who had made private arrangements with Ieyasu beforehand. His coalition won. The opposing coalition, which had presented itself as the protector of Hideyori's inheritance, was broken. Ieyasu spent the following years redistributing domains, rewarding allies, punishing enemies, and arranging the country so that a challenge to Tokugawa authority would require assembling nearly every lord in Japan simultaneously, a coordination problem he correctly calculated nobody would manage to solve. In 1603, the imperial court granted him the title of shogun. He was 61 years old. He had been watching, building, and waiting for most of his adult life, and the patience had paid off with a completeness that left almost no room for argument. Peace and its discontents. Tokugawa Ieyasu moved quickly after Sekigahara to make the victory permanent rather than provisional. The redistribution of domains following the battle was not simply punitive, it was architectural. Lords who had fought against him were reduced in territory or relocated to distant provinces where building a new coalition would take generations. Lords who had supported him were rewarded, but placed in arrangements that kept them dependent. The most powerful domains were positioned so that neighboring lords owed their positions to Tokugawa favor, creating a landscape in which opposing the shogunate meant fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. He passed the title of shogun to his son Hidetada in 1605, just 2 years after receiving it himself, establishing by that act that the position was hereditary Tokugawa property and not a personal grant to an individual. The imperial court confirmed it because the imperial court was not in a position to refuse. The Toyotomi problem required a separate resolution. Hideyori had grown to adulthood in Osaka Castle, and the castle itself remained a focal point for anyone who wished to challenge Tokugawa authority under the banner of restoring Hideyoshi's heir. Ieyasu found his pretext in 1614 through a dispute over an inscription on a bell cast for a new temple in Kyoto, a phrase in the dedication that could be interpreted. With sufficient imagination and political motivation, as an oblique insult to the Tokugawa name, the siege of Osaka Castle followed, first in 1614 with inconclusive results. Then, again, in the summer of 1615, when Tokugawa forces filled in the outer moats as part of an agreed ceasefire and then attacked before they could be redug. Hideyori died during the fall of the castle. With him went the last serious challenge to Tokugawa authority from within Japan, and the period of active warfare that had defined the previous century and a half came to a close with a finality that neither side in any previous conflict had quite managed to achieve. The Tokugawa shogunate then set about engineering a social and political stability that they intended to last indefinitely. The mechanisms were numerous and interlocking. The Sankin Kotai system, formalized in the 1630s, required all daimyo to spend alternating years in the shogunal capital at Edo, the city that would eventually become Tokyo, and at their home domains. When a daimyo returned to his domain, his family remained in Edo. The system served as both a surveillance mechanism and an enormous economic drain on the daimyo class, since maintaining 2 complete households, a formal residence in Edo, and the expensive processions required for the annual travel consumed resources that might otherwise have funded military ambitions. It was a remarkably efficient way to prevent rebellion without having to suppress it, and it had the additional side effect of making Edo one of the largest and most economically active cities in the world by the 1800s. The shogunate also moved decisively against Christianity, which had been spreading through Japan since the mid-1500s, following the arrival of Jesuit missionaries, and had accumulated a significant number of converts, particularly in Kyushu. Christianity presented a political problem because it created communities with loyalties that existed outside the Tokugawa system, believers who answered to a foreign religious authority and whose network connected Japanese converts to each other and to foreign powers. The persecution escalated through the 1620s and 30s, culminating in the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 and 1638, in which a predominantly Christian peasant population in Kyushu rose against their daimyo over a combination of religious persecution and harsh taxation. The rebellion was suppressed after a prolonged siege of the rebels' position at Hara Castle, and the shogunate used the aftermath to finalize the closure of Japan to most foreign contact. The Sokoku edicts restricted international trade to a small Dutch trading post on an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor and limited contact with China and Korea to controlled channels. The policy of national seclusion would remain in place for over 2 centuries. Within this sealed and ordered world, the samurai faced a problem that no amount of military training had prepared them for. There was nothing to fight. The Tokugawa peace settled over Japan and simply stayed there, generation after generation, while the warrior class continued to exist as a legally defined social category with its own rights, privileges, and obligations, but without any war to justify those distinctions. A samurai in the Edo period received a hereditary stipend paid in rice from his lord, wore 2 swords as the visible mark of his status, and was governed by a set of behavioral expectations that distinguished him sharply from the farmers, artisans, and merchants who composed the other officially recognized social categories beneath him. He was, in theory, a warrior. In practice, he was an administrator, a bureaucrat, a scholar, or, if his lord's finances were particularly strained, a man who made umbrellas or sandals at home and pretended the neighbors hadn't noticed. The transformation of the samurai into primarily a governing and administrative class was gradual and uneven, but largely complete by the middle of the Edo period. The shogunate and domain governments required enormous amounts of paperwork, personnel management, judicial administration, and fiscal oversight, and the samurai class supplied the workforce for all of it. A samurai who had never drawn his sword in anger might spend his entire career processing land survey records or managing the logistics of a daimyo's procession to Edo. The swords at his belt were real and maintained to a standard, but their practical function had become more symbolic than military. This tension between the warrior identity and the peacetime reality produced some of the period's most interesting cultural artifacts. Miyamoto Musashi, who had fought in Sekigahara as a teenager and went on to an extraordinary career as a duelist, reportedly winning over 60 individual combats without a loss, spent his later years writing the Gorin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings, a treatise on strategy and combat philosophy that transcends its immediate subject matter and has been read as a guide to competitive thinking in contexts far removed from swordsmanship. He died in 1645, not in battle, but peacefully, having spent his final years in a cave writing and contemplating. The Edo period had made a philosopher of its greatest duelist. Yamamoto Tsunetomo's Hagakure, compiled in the early 1700s and famously containing the line that the way of the samurai is found in death, was written by a man who had never fought a battle and had spent his career as a domain administrator. His articulation of absolute loyalty unto death as the core samurai value was in some ways more intense, precisely because it described an ideal that the peacetime world provided no ordinary opportunity to enact. When you cannot demonstrate loyalty through combat, you describe it in philosophy instead, and the descriptions tend toward the absolute. The incident that captured the era's complicated relationship with samurai values most completely was the Akko vendetta of 1701 to 1703. A provincial lord named Asano Naganori attacked a court official named Kira Yoshinaka within the shogun's castle, a serious breach of etiquette that carried the death penalty regardless of provocation and was ordered to commit ritual suicide, His domain was abolished. His retainers became ronin, masterless samurai, with no lord to serve and no stipend to live on. 47 of them spent nearly 2 years planning and preparing before attacking Kira's residence in the middle of winter, killing him, and carrying his head to their lord's grave. They then surrendered to the authorities and were ordered to commit ritual suicide themselves, which they did. The entire sequence was simultaneously a serious breach of public order, private vengeance was illegal, and a perfect illustration of the absolute loyalty the warrior code demanded. The shogunate was uncomfortable. The public was fascinated. The 47 men became, almost immediately, the most celebrated example of samurai virtue in Japanese cultural history, and have remained so ever since, which says something about the kind of stories the Edo period needed to tell itself. The world behind the castle walls. Edo period Japan was a society that believed deeply in categories. Everything and everyone had a designated place, a defined role, and a set of behavioral expectations attached to that role, with the kind of specificity that suggests the people designing the system were either very confident about human nature or very anxious about what would happen if it were left to organize itself. The official social order was inherited from older Confucian frameworks and sorted the population into 4 tiers: samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants. Below these 4 recognized classes existed groups of people who performed work considered ritually impure: leather workers, executioners, and others who were categorized outside the system entirely and faced severe legal and social restrictions. The arrangement was presented as natural and permanent, which is what arrangements that serve the people designing them tend to claim. The samurai class composed somewhere between 6 and 8% of the total population during the Edo period. In practical terms, this meant that the average castle town of any size contained a substantial samurai quarter, where retainers and their families lived on stipends paid by their domain lord in measures of rice. A high-ranking samurai family occupied a respectable residence with a small garden, maintained their weapons and equipment, dressed in layered kimono with the formal divided skirt called hakama for official occasions, and wore their 2 swords, the longer katana and the shorter wakizashi, whenever appearing in public. The 2 swords were the most visible marker of samurai identity and status, and wearing them in contexts where they were not appropriate or wearing them when you were not entitled to was a serious offense. The right to wear 2 swords was not a fashion choice. It was a legal privilege with enforceable boundaries. A senior domain official of samurai rank spent his days in administrative work, reviewing documents, attending councils, overseeing taxation, managing personnel, and conducting the enormous volume of correspondence that running a domain government required. A lower-ranking samurai of modest stipend might guard a gate, escort officials, or perform ceremonial functions that required the presence of a man with swords rather than any particular skill. The stipend system meant that income was fixed by rank rather than performance, which produced both stability and stagnation in roughly equal measure. A samurai family whose stipend had been set 2 generations earlier lived on the same income regardless of whether the rice price had changed, whether the domain's finances had deteriorated, or whether the family had grown. By the later Edo period, many lower-ranking samurai families were quietly impoverished while maintaining the external markers of their status with careful attention. The farmer class occupied the 2nd tier of official social ranking, which reflected the Confucian value placed on agricultural production as the foundation of civilizational stability. It did not reflect the farmer's actual standard of living, which was in most cases considerably below that of the samurai, and subject to the additional pressure of taxation rates that claimed a substantial portion of each harvest, typically between 40 and 50% of the rice. Crop, though this varied by domain and period. Farmers in good years in productive regions ate reasonably well. In poor years, in marginal agricultural areas, they did not. The staple diet of the rural population was not white rice, which was largely produced for tax payment and samurai consumption, but rather millet, barley, and a mixture of whatever else the household could grow or gather. Daikon radish, wild vegetables, and salted fish supplemented the grain base. Miso paste and soy sauce, both fermented products that kept reasonably well, were fundamental flavoring agents in every social class's cooking, which remains one of the more durable continuities between Edo period Japan and the present. Artisans occupied the third tier, valued for producing the goods that kept society functioning. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, lacquerware makers, and the swordsmiths, whose craft had been refined over centuries into something approaching an art form. All of these belonged to the artisan class and lived in the craft quarters of castle towns, organized roughly by trade. The swordsmiths occupied a particularly complex social position, since their product was central to samurai identity and demanded by the ruling class, which gave them practical leverage that their official social position did not acknowledge. A master swordsmith in active demand could live very comfortably while technically ranking below both the farmers and the samurai who needed what he made. The merchant class sat at the bottom of the official hierarchy, which was the theoretical position of people who produced nothing themselves but profited from exchanging what others produced. The Confucian framework regarded commerce with a suspicion rooted in the idea that profit-taking without physical labor was inherently parasitic. This view was sincerely held in official circles and largely irrelevant in practical terms, because the merchants of Edo period Japan were, by the middle of the period, among the wealthiest people in the country. The great merchant houses of Osaka in particular accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the stipends of most samurai families and exceeded the budgets of many domain governments. A merchant family of the established Chonin townspeople class in Osaka or Edo during the 1700s lived in a well-appointed urban residence, ate better than most samurai could afford, wore the finest cotton, and occasionally managed to circumvent the sumptuary laws that restricted silk to higher social classes, and patronized theatres, tea-houses, and entertainment districts with an enthusiasm that their official social position was supposed to prevent them from displaying. The cultural life of the townspeople was one of the Edo period's most vigorous and creative developments. Kabuki theatre, with its elaborate costumes, dramatic staging, and stories drawn from both samurai history and contemporary urban life, developed in Edo and Osaka as primarily a commoner entertainment form and became enormously popular. Woodblock printing made visual art affordable and widely distributed the ukiyo-e prints depicting actors, landscapes, historical scenes, and the inhabitants of the entertainment districts reached audiences across the country and eventually, after the opening of Japan in the 19th century, across the world. The public bathhouses that operated in every significant town served as social gathering points for people who might have had no other comfortable space for community life, and the culture of the sento, the communal bath, reflected both the practical necessity of bathing without private plumbing and the broadly social character of Edo period urban life. Food in the cities developed with the same creativity that characterized the cultural output. Edo developed its own variant of sushi during this period, the quick-pressed and later hand-formed rice and fish preparations that street vendors sold from stalls along the canals, practical and affordable and entirely distinct from the fermented rice preparations of earlier centuries. Soba noodles, made from buckwheat flour, became a staple of the Edo urban diet and supported hundreds of noodle shops. Tempura vegetables and seafood coated in a light batter and fried was another street food of this period. Its technique possibly influenced by Portuguese cooking methods brought during the brief period of contact before the Sakoku edicts. Tofu in various preparations provided protein across all social classes at a price that made it universally accessible. The tea ceremony, which had been developing since the Muromachi period under the influence of Zen Buddhist aesthetics, was by the Edo period a formalized cultural practice with its own schools, lineages of masters, an elaborate material culture of bowls, scoops, and whisks. Among the samurai class, it functioned partly as an aesthetic discipline and partly as a social ritual. The tea room was one of the few spaces where rank distinctions were partially suspended, where a host of lower status could theoretically receive a guest of higher status on terms defined by the ritual rather than the social hierarchy. In practice, the suspension was imperfect, but the aspiration was part of what gave the practice its particular resonance. The contradictions embedded in the Edo social system deepened as the period extended. A merchant family of real wealth navigated a world in which they were officially ranked below farmers but practically capable of lending money to daimyo, who could not meet their administrative costs. Samurai families of genuine poverty maintained a pride in status that their stipends no longer supported. Domain governments across Japan struggled with structural deficits, borrowing from merchant houses while officially regarding those houses as social inferiors. The categories remained formally intact. The reality inside them shifted constantly, pressed by economics, population growth, and 2.5 centuries of a peace that had made the warrior class's military function largely theoretical, while leaving its social position legally untouched. The world inside the castle walls was orderly, intricate, and under increasing internal pressure by the time the outside world began pressing against it from without. Black ships and a cracking world. On the 8th day of the 7th month of 1853, 4 warships entered Edo Bay and anchored within sight of the shore. 2 of the 4 were steamships, which was a technology that Japan had not yet developed and had not been permitted to acquire during the Sakoku period, and they moved without sails in a way that observers on the shore found deeply unsettling. The ships were painted black, and the phrase that became attached to them kurofune. Black ships carried in the Japanese language an atmosphere of dread that the literal description barely captures. Their commander was Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, and he carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore requesting that Japan open its ports to American vessels for trade and resupply. Perry made clear that he expected an answer and that he would return the following year to receive one. The shogunate's response to Perry's arrival revealed in concentrated form the vulnerabilities that 2.5 centuries of internal peace had allowed to accumulate. The coastal defences around Edo Bay were inadequate against steam-powered warships carrying modern artillery, and everyone who looked at them knew it. The Tokugawa government had no navy of any consequence and no military technology capable of expelling the American ships by force. The political leadership was divided between those who recognized that some accommodation with Western powers was unavoidable and those who found the idea of any accommodation intolerable. The shogunate did something it had rarely needed to do before it consulted the imperial court in Kyoto and circulated the question of how to respond among the domain lords, an admission of uncertainty that undermined its own authority by suggesting the decision was too large for the shogunate to make alone. Perry returned in February of 1854 with a larger fleet and received the Convention of Kanagawa, which opened 2 Japanese ports to American ships and established a resident American consul. The Harris Treaty of 1858 went considerably further, opening additional ports to trade, establishing extraterritorial legal rights for American citizens in Japan, and setting tariff rates that Japan had no power to control. Similar agreements followed with Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands. The treaties were signed by the shogunate under conditions that left little room for genuine negotiation, and they were immediately controversial within Japan in ways that cut across the domain boundaries and social categories of the Tokugawa order. The political movement that crystallized in opposition to the shogunate's handling of the foreign crisis organized around the slogan "Sono Joy," revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The phrase combined 2 distinct ideas that were not entirely compatible with each other in practice, but were extremely effective as political messaging. Reverence for the emperor implied that the shogunate, which had governed in the emperor's name for over 2.5 centuries while keeping the imperial institution in careful ceremonial isolation, was an illegitimate intermediary, Expelling the barbarians was a demand that the shogunate's entire foreign policy approach be reversed, which the shogunate's own advisors knew was militarily impossible, but which had considerable emotional appeal among those who had not examined it closely. Naosuke, the senior Tokugawa official who signed the Harris Treaty in 1858, and then attempted to suppress the resulting political opposition through a series of arrests and executions known as the Ansei Purge, was assassinated outside the shogunate's Edo castle in the third month of 1860 by a group of warriors from the Mito domain, acting in the name of the Sono-joi cause. The killing of the shogunate's most powerful official in front of his own headquarters demonstrated that the political order was under genuine physical threat and that the instruments of Tokugawa authority were no longer capable of protecting even their own leadership without restriction. The domains of Choshu in western Honshu and Satsuma in southern Kyushu became the centers of anti-shogunate activity. Both were powerful domains whose ruling families had been on the losing side at Sekigahara in 1600 and had spent over 2 centuries under Tokugawa arrangements designed to limit their ability to challenge the central family. Government. They had accumulated grievances and, crucially, they had been paying attention to developments in military technology with a speed and seriousness that the shogunate had not matched. Choshu domain began training mixed-class rifle units commoners as well as samurai, armed with modern firearms that contradicted the social principles of the Tokugawa order but produced a more effective military force than tradition-bound samurai units equipped with older weapons. The shogunate's attempts to assert military authority against the restive domains produced increasingly poor results. When Choshu gunners fired on foreign shipping in the Shimonoseki Strait in 1863, enforcing the Sono-joi policy with actual artillery, the response was a combined Western naval bombardment in 1864 that silenced the Choshu shore batteries and destroyed their military installations with a thoroughness that illustrated precisely how large the gap between Japanese military capacity and Western naval firepower had become. Choshu's defeat at the hands of Western forces did not moderate the domain's opposition to the shogunate. If anything, it hardened the conclusion already forming among reform-minded officials within the domain that Japan needed to modernize its military as rapidly as possible, and that modernization could not happen under the existing political structure. The shogunate's own expedition against Choshu in 1866 collapsed when Satsuma, which the shogunate had expected to participate in the punitive campaign, instead remained neutral under the terms of a secret alliance it had been negotiating with Choshu. The Satsuma-Choshu alliance, brokered by the remarkable political operator Sakamoto Ryoma, united the two most powerful opposition domains and gave the anti-shogunate movement a military foundation it had previously lacked. When the shogunate's forces moved against Choshu anyway, they found an opponent that had modernized its military substantially, and the campaign ended without the decisive result the shogunate needed. A shogunate that could not enforce its decisions militarily had very limited options remaining. The economic disruption accompanying the opening of trade added pressure from below. The influx of foreign goods, the outflow of gold and silver through terms set by treaties Japan had negotiated from weakness, and the inflation that followed the market disruption drove up prices for basic goods, including the rice on which samurai stipends and domain finances depended. Silk and tea exports enriched some segments of the agricultural population, but created regional economic inequalities that generated social friction. Merchants, who had connections to the new foreign trade networks, accumulated wealth rapidly, while the fixed stipend samurai class found their already strained finances deteriorating further. The economic stresses that the Edo system had been managing through its rigid structures were now amplified by forces that the structures had not been designed to accommodate. Within the imperial court in Kyoto, a younger generation of court nobles had been cultivating connections with the anti-shogunate samurai from Choshu and Satsuma, and the political concept developing in those networks was something genuinely new in Japanese history. Rather than simply replacing one shogunate with another, or restoring a version of the Heian imperial system, the reformers around Satsuma and Choshu were beginning to discuss a wholesale restructuring of Japanese governance along lines suggested by their observations of Western nation-states. A centralized government with a national military, capable of defending Japan's sovereignty against the kind of pressure that had produced the unequal treaties. The samurai in this vision would not be abolished. They would be transformed into the officer class of a national army, or so some of them believed. What was actually coming for the samurai class was more complete than any of them had yet imagined. The emperor returns. The Tokugawa shogunate's final collapse came with a speed that surprised even those who had spent years working toward it. In the 12th month of 1867, the last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, formally returned governing authority to the imperial throne, an act framed as voluntary restoration but conducted under the very clear understanding that the military situation left limited alternatives. Yoshinobu was an intelligent man who had recognized before most of his advisors that the shogunate's position was not recoverable, and he calculated that a graceful withdrawal gave the Tokugawa family better long-term prospects than a military defeat. The calculation was partially correct. The family survived, the institution did not. The imperial restoration, announced on the third day of the first month of 1868, declared the resumption of direct imperial rule under the young Emperor Mutsuhito, who was 15 years old and would reign under the era name Meiji Enlightened Rule. The men who actually held power behind the throne were the coalition of Satsuma and Choshu samurai, court nobles, and reform-minded officials who had engineered the political transition. They moved immediately to consolidate their position against the shogunate's remaining loyalists through what became known as the Boshin War, a civil conflict that ran through 1868 and into 1869, fought between imperial forces moving northward and the Tokugawa-aligned domains that had not accepted the restoration. The largest potential confrontation was avoided through negotiation. Edo Castle, the administrative center of the Tokugawa shogunate and the most formidable fortified position in Japan, was surrendered without a fight through the efforts of the former shogunate's naval commander, Katsu Kaishu, and the imperial forces representative, Saigo Takamori of Satsuma. The peaceful transfer of Edo prevented the kind of prolonged siege that might have destroyed the city and generated lasting resentment among its population. The final resistance of the shogunate's loyalists was extinguished at Hakodate in the northern island of Hokkaido in the 5th month of 1869, where a group of former shogunate officials had established a short-lived breakaway republic and were reduced by combined land and naval assault. With Hakodate, the Boshin War ended. The new Meiji government moved with extraordinary energy and a genuine willingness to dismantle arrangements that had defined Japanese society for centuries. The men running it had studied the Western powers that had humiliated Japan with the unequal treaties and had drawn an unsentimental conclusion. The gap between Japan's current capabilities and those of the industrialized Western nations was large, and closing it required reorganizing Japanese society from its foundations. The 5 Charter Oath of the 4th month of 1868 had committed the new government to seeking knowledge throughout the world and abandoning outdated customs. The document was sufficiently vague to accommodate enormous range in interpretation, and the Meiji oligarchs interpreted it as license for comprehensive transformation. The domain system was abolished in 1871, replacing the patchwork of over 200 semi-autonomous daimyo territories with a system of centrally administered prefectures. The daimyo received noble titles and generous compensation and were relocated to Tokyo as Edo had been renamed where they could be kept within reach without their domains to administer. The domain armies were simultaneously dissolved, their weapons and personnel absorbed into the new national military structure being assembled under central government direction. This was done swiftly and with enough financial compensation to soften immediate resistance but it fundamentally severed the connection between the daimyo and the warriors who had served them that had been the structural basis of the samurai system since the Heian period. The conscription ordinance of 1873 established a national army built on universal male military service rather than hereditary warrior status. The document accompanying the ordinance explicitly stated that the old distinction between warrior and commoner in military matters was abolished, and that all Japanese men shared the obligation of national defense. The samurai who had derived their social identity and legal privileges from their hereditary status as Japan's military class now found themselves notionally equivalent to the farmers and merchants the Tokugawa system had ranked beneath them. The framing of the conscription ordinance went further still, describing the old samurai class as having monopolized military service as a private privilege and presenting the new universal conscription as a restoration of proper national spirit. The men writing the ordinance were themselves of samurai background, which gave their critique of samurai privilege a particular edge. The economic dismantling of the samurai class followed through the early 1870s. The hereditary stipends that had supported samurai families for generations were first reduced and then, in 1873, converted into government bonds that paid a fixed interest rate, a process called chichirokuden that replaced a perpetual income right with a one-time capital settlement. The settlement was generous by calculation and inadequate by practice, since most samurai families had no experience managing capital, no access to investment opportunities, and no alternative source of income established. A class of people who had been administrators and warriors for generations was now expected to become farmers, merchants, or entrepreneurs with limited preparation and in competition with people who had spent those generations developing exactly those skills. The Heitorei Edict of 1876 completed the legal dismantling by prohibiting the wearing of swords in public. The sword prohibition was not primarily a safety measure, though it was framed partly in those terms. It was the removal of the most visible marker of samurai identity, the thing that had distinguished a samurai from every other person on a public street for centuries. Wearing two swords had been a legal right and a social signal simultaneously, and the edict abolished both at once. Former samurai were now indistinguishable from former commoners in their appearance, in their legal rights, and increasingly in their economic circumstances. The Iwakura mission of 1871 to 1873 had sent a large delegation of Meiji government officials and students to the United States and Europe to observe Western institutions, industries, and systems of governance firsthand. The mission returned with detailed notes, strong impressions, and a sharpened sense of what Japan needed to build. Railways were constructed, telegraph lines went up, Western-style buildings appeared in Tokyo alongside older structures. A modern postal system was established. Western legal codes were studied and adapted. Japanese students were sent abroad. Foreign experts were hired to teach in Japanese universities and advise Japanese industries. The transformation of the physical and institutional landscape of Japan during the 1870s and 1880s was comprehensive enough that a person returning after a decade's absence would have found the country substantially unrecognizable in its urban centers. The samurai class absorbed all of this with reactions that ranged across a wide spectrum. Some former samurai adapted with impressive flexibility, finding roles in the new government bureaucracy, military officer corps, legal system, journalism, and emerging business sector. The Meiji government itself was staffed largely by men of samurai background who had driven the transformation, which created the odd situation of a class simultaneously dismantling its own privileges and occupying the positions of power that replaced them. Others found the transition impossible economically, psychologically, or both. The combination of lost stipends, abolished social status, and the public prohibition on the symbols of their identity generated grievances that had not yet found expression but were accumulating with the pressure of everything the previous decade had overturned. The government had built a new Japan at remarkable speed. What it had not fully resolved was what to do with the people who had been the old Japan's ruling class, and some of those people were beginning to reach conclusions of their own. The last stand at Shiroyama. Saigo Takamori was, in many respects, the person most responsible for creating the world that destroyed him. He had been central to the Satsuma-Choshu alliance that made the Meiji Restoration possible, had negotiated the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle that prevented the Boshin War from becoming significantly more destructive, and had served in the early Meiji government as one of its most senior military figures. He was large by the physical standards of his era, personally commanding, and regarded by those around him with a mixture of admiration and careful attention. He was also, by the early 1870s, deeply uncomfortable with the direction Japan's transformation was taking, not because he opposed modernization in principle, but because the specific human cost of the changes, particularly to the samurai class that had made the whole transition possible, struck him as a form of ingratitude that the government was conducting with too much efficiency and too little concern for those being displaced. The break came in 1873 over a debate about Korea. Saigo had proposed that Japan send a mission to Korea to demand the renegotiation of diplomatic relations, and he had volunteered to lead it himself, apparently believing that Korea would likely respond to his presence with violence, which would provide justification for military intervention. The officials who had just returned from the Iwakura mission, having spent 2 years observing Western industrial and military capacity firsthand, argued forcefully that Japan was not yet strong enough to risk a foreign war that might draw in China or Western powers. The debate was resolved against Saigo's position, and he resigned from the government and returned to his home domain of Satsuma in the south. Back in Kagoshima, Saigo established a network of private military academies called Shigako that trained young Satsuma men in traditional martial arts alongside modern military skills. The schools became centers of former samurai culture and identity in a domain that had produced a disproportionate share of the Meiji Restoration's leadership, and now found itself watching the fruits of that effort distributed in ways that seemed to benefit everyone except the Satsuma samurai who had taken the largest risks. The accumulated resentments over stipend reductions, over the sword prohibition, over the conscription system that had replaced samurai military status with universal service, had a location and a community in which to develop. In the first month of 1877, students from the Shigako raided government arms depots around Kagoshima, apparently acting on the belief that the government was planning to move against Saigo and the academies. Saigo, presented with a situation that had developed without his direct initiation, chose to lead the resulting rebellion rather than abandon the men who had organized themselves around his example. Whether he believed the rebellion could succeed militarily is genuinely unclear. Several accounts suggest he understood the odds with complete clarity and chose to go forward anyway, which would make his decision less a military calculation than a statement about what his life had meant and what he was willing to do in defense of it. The Satsuma rebellion began with a force of somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 men, experienced warriors, many of them trained in both traditional and modern military methods, moving north from Kagoshima toward the government garrison at Kumamoto Castle. The castle was held by a relatively small government force of conscript troops, and the expectation among the Satsuma leadership was that it would fall quickly. It did not. The garrison under Major General Tani Tateki held the castle through a siege that lasted 54 days, enduring shortages of food and ammunition while government relief forces made their way south. The conscript soldiers defending Kumamoto performed with a discipline and steadiness that contradicted the Satsuma leadership's assessment of what men without samurai backgrounds could be expected to do under sustained pressure. The siege of Kumamoto was the high point of the Satsuma forces' military position. Once government relief columns broke through to the castle in mid-spring of 1877, the strategic situation shifted decisively. The Meiji government deployed its new national army with a scale and organizational capacity that the rebellion could not match, eventually assembling a force of over 60,000 men supported by artillery modern rifles, naval gunfire from warships operating along the coast, and a logistical apparatus capable of sustaining a prolonged campaign. The government force was commanded by figures including Yamagata Aritomo, who had been one of the principal architects of the new conscript military system, and who conducted the campaign with the methodical competence of a man who had specifically designed the instrument he was now using. The battles across Kyushu through the spring and summer of 1877 gradually reduced the Satsuma forces in numbers and territory. The fighting at Tabaruzaka in late winter had been fierce and costly on both sides, demonstrating that the Satsuma warriors were formidable opponents in close-quarters combat even against numerically superior forces with better equipment. But the mathematical realities of a prolonged campaign against an opponent with virtually unlimited ability to replace casualties and resupply ammunition could not be overcome by individual martial excellence. The Satsuma force contracted, was surrounded, broke out, contracted again, and continued to shrink through a fighting retreat southward back toward Kagoshima. By the 9th month of 1877, Saigo's entire remaining force had been reduced to somewhere between 300 and 500 men. They occupied Shiroyama, a hill overlooking the city of Kagoshima, surrounded by a government army of several thousand and warships in the bay below. The government commander sent Saigo a message offering terms a remarkable gesture given the scale of the rebellion, which suggested a reluctance to end the affair in the most obvious way. Saigo did not respond. The final assault on Shiroyama came before dawn on the 24th day of the 9th month of 1877. Government forces moved uphill from multiple directions in the darkness, and the fighting that followed in the early morning hours was close, intense, and brief. Saigo was wounded during the descent from the hill. Accounts differ on the precise circumstances, some saying he was struck by rifle fire, others that he was already severely wounded when a retainer assisted him in performing the ritual of seppuku before the government forces reached him. He was 49 years old. By the time full daylight came, the battle was over, and the last significant armed resistance of the samurai class to the new order had ended on a hillside above the city where it had begun. The government buried him with appropriate ceremony, which might seem contradictory given that he had just led an armed rebellion against it, but the contradiction resolved itself along lines that Japanese political culture handled with more ease than some others might have managed. Saigo had been a rebel, but he had been a recognizably Japanese rebel, motivated by loyalty, by a code of honor, by the protection of a tradition, by the kind of death before compromise values that the warrior tradition had always claimed as its core. The government could execute that idea while honoring the man who had embodied it, and in doing so, transform his defeat into a usable myth. He was formally pardoned in 1889, when the Meiji Constitution was promulgated. His statue was erected in Ueno Park in Tokyo, and his rebellion was incorporated into the national story, not as a threat that had been suppressed, but as a tragedy that had been necessary, the painful but inevitable end of a noble tradition, clearing the way for something Japan needed to become. The samurai who survived the Meiji period's transformations without taking up arms moved into the new structures as best they could. Some found the adaptation straightforward. Others carried the displacement quietly for the rest of their lives. The class was gone as a legal category, its privileges dissolved, its social markers removed, its military function transferred to an institution that wore Western-style uniforms and drilled in Western formations. What remained was harder to legislate away. The ghost that refused to leave. The samurai class was legally abolished. The stipends were converted. The swords were prohibited. The social hierarchy that had placed warriors at its apex for 7 centuries was dissolved into the universal citizenship of the Meiji state. On paper and in law, the samurai were finished. What happened next was that their image, their vocabulary, and their aesthetic framework proved considerably more durable than any of the institutions that had housed them. And in the decades following the Satsuma Rebellion, they became something that a living warrior class could never quite have been: a usable, ideal, portable and adaptable, available to be applied to purposes that the original samurai would have found variously familiar, puzzling, and alarming. The first and most consequential application was nationalism. The Meiji government was building a modern nation-state and needed a story that connected the new Japan to something ancient and distinctly Japanese, something that could stand alongside the national myths of the Western powers, while remaining unmistakably its own. The samurai provided this. The warrior tradition was reframed as the expression of a specifically Japanese spirit that predated and transcended any particular political arrangement, and the virtues associated with samurai culture, loyalty, discipline, self-sacrifice, the subordination of personal interest to collective obligation were presented as the natural character of the Japanese people, expressed through their most representative historical figure. The process required considerable selective memory. The actual history of the samurai class, with its persistent factional violence, its frequent betrayals, its market negotiations over loyalty, and the gap between its ideals and its practice, was not what the nationalist project needed. What it needed was the ideal, and the ideal was available. Nitobe Inazo's book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1900, and originally written in English for a Western audience, was enormously influential in both directions, shaping how Westerners understood Japanese culture and simultaneously reinforcing within Japan the idea that Bushido represented a coherent, ancient, and defining ethical code. Nitobe drew comparisons between Bushido and European chivalry, framed samurai ethics in terms accessible to readers familiar with Western moral philosophy, and presented the warrior code as the spiritual foundation of Japanese civilization. The book was widely read, translated into multiple languages, and cited repeatedly by people on multiple continents who wanted a framework for understanding Japan. It was also, as later scholars have noted, substantially a construction of the Meiji period, rather than a faithful description of how samurai had actually thought and behaved across the centuries. Bushido, as Nitobe described it, was a retrospective synthesis reel in its cultural effects, if not entirely in its historical accuracy. The Meiji military incorporated samurai aesthetics thoroughly. The officer corps of the Imperial Japanese Army identified with samurai tradition and drew on its language and imagery in everything from training philosophy to the expected conduct of officers in battle. The sword remained a commissioned officer's sidearm long after it had been superseded militarily, serving as a symbol of warrior lineage that connected the modern military to the historical tradition. The military education system taught loyalty and self-sacrifice as explicitly warrior values, and the expectation that an officer would choose death over surrender or capture drew directly from samurai precedent. These connections deepened through the 1910s, 20s, and 30s as Japanese military culture moved in increasingly extreme directions, and they reached their most terrible expression in the Second World War, when the framing of sacrifice as the highest warrior virtue was applied to strategic situations of absolute extremity. The kamikaze pilots who flew their aircraft into Allied warships were presented to the Japanese public in the language of samurai devotion, and the connection was not purely rhetorical, it drew on a genuine cultural inheritance, however catastrophically misapplied. The defeat in 1945 and the American occupation that followed created a complicated moment for samurai culture in Japan. The occupation authorities identified militarism and nationalism as the forces that had driven Japan toward catastrophic war, and samurai iconography had been thoroughly entangled with both. Martial arts were initially prohibited. Jidaigeki, the period dramas set in the samurai era that had been a staple of Japanese cinema and later television, were restricted by occupation censors who saw in them the promotion of feudal values. The restrictions did not last long. By the early 1950s, as the occupation wound down and Japan began the process of rebuilding its cultural identity, the samurai returned to Japanese screens with a different framing, less nationalist than human, less ideological than personal. Akira Kurosawa became the figure most responsible for translating samurai culture into cinematic language that resonated globally. His film Rashomon, released in 1950, used a samurai murder as the framework for an exploration of truth, perspective, and human self-deception that had nothing specifically Japanese about its core questions. Seven Samurai in 1954 followed a group of wandering warriors hired to protect a farming village, building its portrait of the samurai, not around idealized nobility but around exhaustion, pragmatism, and the gap between what warriors are supposed to be and what they actually are. The film was remade in American settings, influenced generations of Western filmmakers, and established the template for a specific kind of ensemble action narrative that has never entirely gone away. George Lucas acknowledged Kurosawa's influence on the original Star Wars, and the debt is visible in both structure and visual approach. The samurai had, through the medium of cinema, become a genuinely global cultural reference point. The martial arts traditions that descended from samurai practice survived the Meiji period's upheavals by transforming themselves into sports, physical disciplines, and philosophical practices rather than military techniques. Judo, developed by Kano Jigoro from older jujutsu traditions in the 1880s, was presented as a system of physical and moral education suitable for the modern world, and it spread internationally with a speed that no previous Japanese cultural export had managed. Kendo, the practice of swordsmanship with bamboo weapons and protective armor, was retained as a physical discipline after the occupation restrictions lifted and became a school sport across Japan. Kyudo, the practice of traditional Japanese archery, continued as a meditative as well as a physical practice. Iaido, the art of drawing and cutting with the sword in a single motion, maintained small but dedicated communities of practitioners who approached the practice with an attention to form and intention that owed more to the Zen-influenced aesthetics of the Edo period than to any battlefield application. In popular culture, the samurai became one of the most traveled figures in global storytelling. Japanese manga and anime explored samurai themes with a range that moved from historical realism to complete fantasy. Vagabond's painstaking examination of Miyamoto Musashi's life, Lone Wolf and Cub's meditation on vengeance and fatherhood in the Edo period, Rurouni Kenshin's exploration of what happens to a warrior when the war is over. These works found audiences across Asia, Europe, and the Americas, and they carried with them, embedded in their narratives, the central questions that the samurai tradition had always generated. What does loyalty require? What does honor cost? What is a life built around violence worth when the violence is no longer needed? The historical sites associated with samurai Japan became significant destinations for both domestic and international visitors. Himeji Castle, the great white fortress in western Honshu that survived the bombings of the Second World War and the demolitions of the Meiji period alike, stands as possibly the best preserved example of Sengoku period military architecture. Kanazawa, whose samurai and merchant districts survived intact, offers a material encounter with Edo period urban organization that few other Japanese cities can provide. The ancient capital of Kyoto contains layers of samurai history in its temples, gardens, and preserved urban quarters, accumulated across 8 centuries of warrior involvement in a city that had once been the prize they all competed to control. What the samurai left behind was not simply nostalgia. It was a set of questions about power, obligation, and identity that proved endlessly generative precisely because they had never been finally answered. The warrior class had existed for 7 centuries, had governed Japan for most of that time, had developed a culture of remarkable coherence and depth, and had been dismantled in the space of a generation. The speed of the ending and the completeness of what was lost gave the tradition a particular kind of poignancy, the feeling of something that had mattered enormously and was now only available at a remove, what the sword left behind. The samurai story begins with a practical problem, an imperial government that could not defend its own borders and needed to borrow the capacity of men it was not certain it could control. It ends with a different kind of government dismantling the class those men became, because it had decided that a modern nation could not afford the social architecture those men required. Between those 2 points stretches roughly 1,000 years of history, across which the warrior class changed shape so many times: provincial enforcer, clan army, shogunal administrator, peacetime bureaucrat, nationalist symbol, cultural ghost, that the samurai of the Heian frontier and the samurai of the Edo stipend rolls shared little beyond a name and the swords at their belts. This degree of transformation is not unusual for institutions that survive long enough. What makes the samurai case worth examining at length is the particular quality of the gap between what the class claimed to be and what it actually was at any given moment, and the way that gap was managed across the centuries. The warrior code, in whatever form it took in any particular period, was always partly aspiration rather than description. The Heian provincial lord who fought for his own land and his own survival was retrospectively absorbed into a tradition of loyal service. The Sengoku daimyo who changed alliances when the tactical situation required, it was celebrated within a culture that elevated loyalty above almost everything else. The Edo period samurai, who had never seen combat administered domains in the name of a warrior identity that his daily life did not enact. The distance between the ideal and the reality was always present, and it was never quite acknowledged directly, and it was a condition of the tradition's functioning rather than a defect in it. What the warrior class provided, at its core, was a framework for organizing masculine identity around obligation to a lord, to a family, to a code, to something larger than personal comfort or survival. This framework operated differently in different periods. During the centuries of active warfare, it was practically expressed in the conduct of campaigns and the maintenance of martial skill. During the long Edo peace, it became increasingly philosophical and aesthetic, a set of attitudes toward craftsmanship, self-discipline, and the acceptance of mortality that could be enacted through the tea ceremony or the practice of calligraphy, as readily as through the management of a sword. The flexibility of the framework, the way it could migrate from the battlefield to the writing desk and still feel continuous, is part of what made it so durable and so exportable. The relationship between the samurai class and the political structures it served deserves particular attention because it resists the simplifications that popular culture tends to apply. The samurai were not simply loyal servants of stable authority. They overthrew the imperial court's administrative monopoly in the 1200s, fought each other continuously through the 14 and 1500s, provided the military muscle for both sides of the Meiji Restoration's civil war, and then produced the rebellion that ended their own existence as a class. They were the force that kept the political order stable and the force that repeatedly destabilized it. They enforced the law and they wrote it and they broke it and they died defending versions of it that contradicted each other. The loyalty that the warrior tradition placed at the center of its value system was always loyalty to something specific, a lord, a domain, a set of relationships, rather than to an abstract principle, which meant that samurai loyalty looked, from certain angles, indistinguishable from samurai factionalism. The difference between a loyal retainer and a rebel depended on which side of the current political arrangement you were standing on. This complexity does not diminish the tradition, it makes it more interesting and more honest than the simplified versions that nostalgia tends to produce. The samurai who have become cultural icons, Miyamoto Musashi, Saigo Takamori, the 47 Ronin are compelling not because they were perfect exemplars of a flawless code, but because they were people navigating genuine contradictions with the tools their culture had given them. Musashi was a duelist who killed people for professional reputation and spent his later years trying to articulate what that experience had meant. Saigo was a modernizer who chose a traditional death rather than accept the world his modernization had produced. The 47 Ronin were loyal retainers who broke the law in order to fulfill the obligations that the law had made impossible to fulfill within its own framework. All three stories are interesting, precisely because the code they illustrate contains genuine tensions that the code itself cannot resolve. The legacy of the samurai in contemporary Japan is layered in ways that reflect all of this complexity. The martial arts descended from samurai practice are taught in schools and practiced in dojos across the country, and they carry within their forms and philosophies a connection to the physical tradition that is genuine, even if the combat application has been largely removed. The historical consciousness of the Edo period persists in the attention to craft, to seasonal awareness, to the aesthetic value of restraint and precision that characterizes specific areas of Japanese cultural production, from ceramics to architecture to cuisine, in ways that scholars have traced to samurai influence on cultural taste during the 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa peace. The castle towns that grew around samurai administration shaped the urban geography of Japan's regional cities in patterns still visible in street layouts and neighborhood names. In the global imagination, the samurai occupy a space that very few historical figures from any culture have managed to claim genuinely universal recognition, combined with sustained fascination across generations. A child in Brazil or Germany or Nigeria who has never studied Japanese history can identify a samurai silhouette, associate it with a set of values and a visual aesthetic, and engage with it through video games, film, or graphic novels with a fluency that requires no specialized knowledge. This degree of cultural penetration is rare and instructive. It suggests that the questions the samurai story raises about what loyalty costs, about what a life organized around a code rather than personal preference looks like, about what happens when the purpose that gave an identity its meaning disappears, are questions that resonate across cultural contexts because they are not specifically Japanese questions. They are human ones. What Japan did with the samurai after the Meiji period was to perform, collectively and over generations, the same act of selective memory that all societies perform with the figures from their past who matter most. The difficult parts, the violence, the class oppression, the gap between the code and the conduct were retained in historical scholarship and in the more serious works of literature and film, while the usable parts, the discipline, the aesthetic sensibility, the devotion to craft and obligation were carried forward into the national character as understood by Japanese and non-Japanese alike. This is not falsification. It is the normal process by which a living culture makes use of its inheritance. The samurai were real people living in real historical circumstances, and they were also, by the time the last of them had gone, already becoming the symbol that the centuries since have refined. 1,000 years is a long time for any institution to persist. The Roman legions, the Byzantine cataphracts, the Ottoman janissaries, the European knights, all warrior traditions that shaped their civilizations, all eventually dissolved by the forces they had been instrumental in creating. What distinguishes the samurai from most of these parallels is the richness and accessibility of the cultural record they left, the paintings, the literature, the philosophy, the martial arts, the architecture, the cinema, and the degree to which that record continues to generate new work, rather than simply preserving old forms. The tradition is not a museum. It is a conversation that Japan and the world have been having for a long time and show no signs of concluding. The sword itself, the katana, perfected over centuries of metallurgical refinement, folded steel layer upon layer until the blade held an edge, and a flexibility that Western smithing traditions achieved through different means was perhaps the most concentrated expression of everything the samurai represented. It was a tool of violence that became an object of beauty. It was a practical instrument that became a philosophical object. It was made by craftsmen of the artisan class for warriors of the samurai class, and is now held in museums and private collections by people who may never have held a weapon of any kind. The gap between what it was made for and what it has become is the same gap the samurai themselves crossed from men who solved the practical problem of an empire that needed defending, to an idea about what human beings can be when they commit themselves completely to something larger than themselves. Whether that idea is accurate is a historical question. Whether it is useful is a different question entirely, and the answer has been coming back yes for a very long time. And so the long story of the samurai quietly closes from those first provincial riders in the hills of ancient Japan, all the way to Shiroyama and beyond, into the films and dojos and museums where they still live today. 1,000 years of loyalty, conflict, beauty, and change, settled now into something softer. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on the screen right now. Just let your eyes find it when you are ready. And if tonight's journey meant something to you, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left in the comments below would mean a great deal. For now, let your body go heavy, let your shoulders sink. Close your eyes. The swords are sheathed. The night is quiet. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.